safety, and in Seattle, anti-displacement, right? So as the cost of living in Seattle goes up, as it becomes harder and harder to access a home or have an affordable place to rent, that people of color want us as environmentalists, that we should all be partnering together to think about, are there environmental solutions that can actually help people have access, that can help keep costs from going up in communities? Can we make sure that, for instance, we don't just invest in a community and do all this beautification and have people who live there currently move out of that community? So this was just a fun one. But I think it's just a sampling of kind of what we heard from community. And as someone who lives in a predominantly people of color part of Seattle, I will say that my experience is the same. Like, it's not about I don't walk out every day thinking like, oh, I'm suffering from worse air pollution here. I walk out thinking about I love this park and I love seeing my neighbors and I love that I live, down the street from a grocery store that I really enjoy going to, or that I can, really quickly access foods that are common in my culture. And that when I walk around, I'm seeing other people and community that I love and care about. And so I think that, sometimes we forget about that, right? We sit somewhere far away from the people that we're trying to solve for, instead of sitting with them and solving the problems together. And so that's what the Equity and Environment Agenda is. It's really a blueprint for advancing race and social justice in Seattle's environmental work. And it's a set of goals and strategies that are intended to serve as a roadmap, not just for city government. We know city government can lead by example, but also for others to take parts of it to understand how they might use some of the lessons in this agenda as ways for them to advance this work as well. So the 4 goal areas, and I'll go through these pretty quickly so that we have some time for questions, are the first one is healthy environments for all. And this is really about understanding issues from the perspective of communities of color. What we know is that government has historically left out a number of issues because we don't have people in the halls of government who are thinking about things like air pollution from a certain perspective, right? So we might not know some of the issues that are happening in our communities if those communities aren't strongly connected into government. So having that understanding, but also knowing that there's a cumulative impacts piece to this. And this is something environmental justice talks about a lot, right? That if you are living in a place that has a high degree of environmental hazards and you experience socioeconomic challenges, so you're lower income, you're a person of color, that actually there are studies that show that your experience of those environmental hazards is exacerbated. So we want to make sure that we aren't just saying like, oh, it's okay that air pollution is at this level across the community, that we're recognizing that people who are lower income or people of color might still be bearing a disproportionate burden. And so we have to dig in there. We have to understand the data, for sure, but we also want to be responding directly to community stories around what are some of the environmental challenges and what things are impacting people's health. This is also connected to the anti-displacement piece that I talked about earlier, where we want to make sure that we aren't just improving the environment without connecting to the community. So what happens otherwise is that we could improve the environment, and if we're tracking asthma rates, we might say 5-10 years from now, oh, the asthma rates have gotten a lot better here. But it might be because we have a whole new population of people living in that area. And the people who had asthma have moved further, in most cases in the Seattle area, they are moving further south and out of the city. Jobs, local economies, and youth pathways. So it was something that came up really consistently in our conversations with folks, that people said, look, the environmental movement has a problem, but you also have some awesome jobs, and we want access to those jobs. We want to be people who are helping solve these problems for our communities. So how can you make sure that when you're thinking about an environmental program, that you're also thinking about the intersection with jobs, that you're thinking about who are the small businesses, who are the local economic engines that can be part of that environmental solution. That we're not just thinking about big, broad solutions, but again, we're really making sure that the economic benefits are coming back to the communities who are most impacted by the issues. Equity in city environmental programs. This is about the leadership piece that I've talked a little bit about, making sure that those who are most affected are at the center of decision making at being able to hold government accountable on these issues, but it's also something more subtle than that too. It's about us asking different questions from the get-go on what programs are we designing. So if we have a rebate program, are we thinking about the fact that rebates serve primarily people in homes? And how do we then build a complementary program? It's not to say that we necessarily stop doing that rebate program, but we might need a different solution for different people who are living in affordable housing units or who are renters in our city, right? So how do we serve different populations? And especially given the changing demographics of Seattle, this becomes really important. It's also having people in the room who can challenge our assumptions and who can ask some of the tough questions, like things, for instance, if you are putting in bike share across the city and you put in bike stations in certain neighborhoods and you say, check the box, we've got access. That's true to a certain degree, but the question then is, do you need a credit card to access that bike share? Because what do you do when you recognize the fact that for many people, access to credit is a real challenge and a significant barrier to being able to participate in many parts of our community, let alone the environmental movement. So it's really being able to challenge some of those assumptions, right? We have to ask different questions to create different solutions. We have to have different people in the room so that we can ask those different questions, because it's certainly not just my brain or Ben's brain that's going to get us to those different questions. And then the final one is around environmental narrative and community leadership. You saw this already a little bit, where we're really centering and highlighting the voices of our community members, of people of color in the work of the environmental movement, to make sure that people recognize that being an environmentalist is about being Hamda, it's about being me, it's about being Ben, it's about being Melanie, right? Like that this is what an environmental movement looks like. And then also recognizing that if we invest in our communities, if we partner with our communities, that we can actually build solutions together, and that there are community-led solutions that are just waiting for that extra oomph or some support. And most of the times, actually, they aren't waiting. They're going ahead and doing the work. So we as government can get together and align with that in order to make sure that those solutions move forward and that we are really building a robust environmental movement. The agenda finishes with 8 community-identified actions for advancing environmental justice in the region. And I'm not going to have time to go into these, but if you look online, you can see them. And these are really powerful leadership opportunities, not just for government, but also for community and philanthropy and our allies in the historically white-led environmental organizations to approach and to figure out moving forward. We're starting on some of these already as city government, and that's kind of the next phase of the work moving forward. And so all of this, I want to bring it back to the thing I started with, is about power, right? So this agenda is fundamentally about centering communities of color to have power in our environmental movement in the city of Seattle. And that is something that's changing how we are shaping programs already. It's shifting the questions that we're asking about programs. And the work of the initiative moving forward is really about, what does that look like now? How do we build programs together? So we have this agenda, it has strong community ownership, but it's really in the work going forward that we'll know, what does that all really mean? And what does it look like when you build power with people of color, when you build an agenda together across communities? We've already changed sort of what the dialogue in Seattle is, so now it's the question of changing what policies and programs and all of the next steps look like. So that's the bit about the Equity and Environment Initiative. I think with that, we will open it up for questions.
Thank you. That was a very impressive and presentation. I really appreciate your personal story and the great work you're doing in the city. My name's Michael Mendez. I'm a Pinchot Faculty Fellow here at FES, and thank you for coming all the way from Seattle. Again, I found impressive about this really community-based initiative, particularly the forming of this diverse social environmental movement, putting forward equity and justice issues and sustainability and climate policies. I wanted to ask you 2 questions about the culture of bureaucracy within the city of Seattle. How are some of the kind of existing staff members, particularly the ones that are focused more on the business as usual approach, integrating some of this justice? Has it been difficult and challenging to get them to think more holistically and than what they had before? And then secondly, in terms of co-benefits, how are you documenting that and tracking that and ensuring that, that they are real and they are transparent? And then lastly, just really quickly, is if you can speak about the initiative on the carbon tax and the split between mainstream environmentalists and environmental justice community.
I may not be able to speak about that last one because I'm here as a representative of government. We do not take positions on initiatives. But on the first two, I will say, in terms of challenging where people are thinking about this work, I think it's an ongoing process, and it really varies depending on the program and the program manager. So I was previously in Seattle Public Utilities as part of their environmental justice and service equity team, and that team actually digs in with a lot of programs throughout the utility to try and get them to shift their focus, and has been quite successful over many, many years doing that work. This initiative was kind of born from that. And so I'd say that it does really vary in some cases, and because we have the backing and the leadership of the mayor, obviously that gives this initiative a lot of space to push and to design new solutions. So for instance, there is now a Duwamish Valley program where the Office of Sustainability and Environment is partnering with a number of other departments. We've hired a Duwamish Valley advisor who is deeply connected in that community to design and think about new ways of approaching our work in that area to ensure that quality of life is something that's really taken into consideration while we're doing, the Superfund cleanup is sort of an EPA-led separate process, but that we as city government have an obligation to protect the people in that area. So that's just an example of an issue area that rose to the surface of this agenda creation process. And then I think, there are other things, like I am partnering really closely with our climate resilience and climate mitigation work in the city. So Seattle has a really awesome new initiative called the Drive Clean Seattle initiative. And so that initiative is about making sure that we are shifting and dealing with our emissions issues in Seattle by shifting to a cleaner vehicles across the way. So whether that's buses or cars, or making sure that people have more of an ability to walk, or light rail, or any number of things that could be transit-related emissions reductions. But one of the things I'm doing is using the agenda and community partners to work together on, so what do some of the solutions need to look like to make sure that communities of color are directly experiencing those benefits? And so you'll see those in the coming months, hopefully. We just released the agenda, I should say, on Earth Day of this year. So we're just beginning to transition into the kind of digging in implementation phase of the work.
Thank you again for being here and for this really great presentation. I enjoyed hearing that. I have a couple of, kind of following on Michael's questions, a couple of questions kind of about how your role is structured and kind of how some of the community leaders' roles are structured. As someone who is in environmental equity work myself and has experienced some of the institutional challenges.
Right.
So one thing that I'm curious, it's really awesome that the mayor of Seattle is so supportive of this work, and it's so instrumental to have visionary leadership in this kind of work. I'm wondering how your role is structured in it, and if you have staff that work under you or very closely with you, because it's a huge lift what you're doing. I'm also, related to that, I'm curious about whether the folks who are on your kind of community leadership board are in any way compensated for their time, or if that is all kind of on a volunteer basis.
So I'll try and remember all the pieces to this question. So first of all, I do have staff, Sarah Cabillos, who's not here in New Haven, but really should be, because she's the brains behind a lot of the work as well. So she works with me as my program coordinator, digging in on a lot of we kind of team on things. Seattle is actually, we have this unique situation that we have the Race and Social Justice Initiative. So we have some amazing staff across the city government who have been digging in on these issues and thinking about things differently. The Environmental Justice and Service Equity team is also part of this work from Seattle Public Utilities. So I would say it's not really that everyone reports to me, which is probably a good thing. It allows me to kind of be working with a lot of other folks as well as spending time in the community. And so that's the structure right now of the initiative. It's embedded within the Seattle Office of Sustainability and Environment. So the director of that office, Jessica Finkoven, is a real leader on these issues as well, very connected and supportive of this work. And so that's, so there's capacity throughout the office. And yes, it's also a really big task, right? So it's both things. And then in terms of the second part of your question, remind me. Oh yes, compensation. So in the first year of the initiative, we actually did have private foundation funding that allowed us to support the organizations that were participating in the Community Partner Steering Committee. As we move forward, we are trying to think of what does that structure need to look like, and how do you do that in a way that makes sure that those resources are going to the right communities and to communities of color and those who are most affected and the least able to participate in these processes. One of the challenges when you create a formal structure in government is then the things that you do in one formal structure could apply as precedent across structures. And so that's something that we're working out right now as we look at what this looks like moving forward. But for the first year of the initiative, they were compensated.
Hi. Is this working? Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you for being here. So I'm participating in the drafting process of a climate action plan here in New Haven. So this is like a city-led process. But I'm a little bit curious about which institutions and organizations, especially in communities of color, that your process connected with. So in New Haven, labor unions are pretty significant, but I guess I'm wondering more specifically what institutions or what organizations you were able to connect with.
So in Seattle, we worked with a number of different community-based organizations who have deep networks in communities of color. They don't all identify as, say, environmental organizations. One America, for instance, was one of the organizations involved. Their mission is around immigrant rights issues. We had Feast, who was part of our work. They work primarily on youth leadership and food empowerment issues. It was a pretty wide array of organizations, and part of how we were able to select organizations was one, my background and experience, as well as a couple of the other folks who were helping design this initiative. We have pretty deep relationships in communities of color. So we were looking for organizations and individuals really specifically from those organizations. It was really important for us to take out the understanding of sort of the tendency is to go to executive directors of organizations and the organization has to have the right name. The executive director they have to be the right person. And so what we did was we actually, for the most part, except for a couple organizations where they have newer executive directors, we worked with program staff as part of the steering committee. That was also about us raising up and in that effort, diversifying who is leading on these issues. So it's not just the executive directors having a chance to be part of a steering committee like this, but also recognizing that there are individuals who are within organizations who might have a stronger connection to wanting to help shape the environmental movement and have other not have the same level of commitments already that an executive director might have. So for instance, Roshni Sampath, who worked with us from the Statewide Poverty Action Network, she actually has a degree in environmental sciences, but her day job is working with low-income community members on and policy advocacy in that arena. So it was knowing people, it was finding the right people, and then having those folks together as part of a community partner steering committee. And so there's unfortunately no like clear example. We also did outreach to labor community members, and they will continue to be partners with us. Labor in Seattle is partners with many of the organizations that are part of our community partner steering committee, so we were able to bring a pretty strong worker focus into the work as well.
So a quick question. In the creation of the initiative and the stakeholder or the steering committee, were there other cities or that you looked to as models, or were there alternatives that you looked at before you guys decided on the steering committee as a method to advance the EJ principles?
So the city I would say that we looked to the most was Portland. Desiree Williams-Raji, who works in Portland, had led a really innovative process around their climate action planning work to center it on equity, and had similarly created a model that worked directly with communities of color, then partnered with the kind of historically white-led environmental organizations. So Desiree was someone that I talked to quite a bit as we were forming this initiative. We were also looking to just kind of social justice movement work within government more broadly. And I think there was quite a bit of evidence that it would be helpful to have a strategy that started with those most affected, and knowing that in order to have broad community ownership of environmental justice, that we really needed to do that. Because environmental justice historically has not really been held by city government. It's usually a community advocacy body of work. And so we wanted to be really thoughtful about making sure that this was designed with those folks who are leaders in this work. And so that's, I would say Portland was the one we looked to the most, but it was also just our experience in doing smaller things within Seattle that weren't necessarily citywide that gave us some of the understanding of how to approach this.
Hi, I'm Brad Gentry. I'm one of the associate deans here. I wanted to pick up on your comment about working with historically white-led environmental organizations. And I guess two questions. Were any of those efforts successful in your view? And to the extent that they were there any sort of lessons learned from that other historically white-led environmental organizations might consider using down the road?
Sure. Well, I should acknowledge, first of all, that we, as the Office of Sustainability and Environment of the City of Seattle, are a historically white-led environmental organization. You see me here, that does not mean this is reflective of our office. So that's important to note, because I like to think that the initiative is successful, therefore, if it's embedded within a historically white-led organization. But that's a flippant answer. I will say seriously that the organizations that participated in our workshops had some pretty big breakthroughs in terms of understanding and approach, that a number of them are now finding ways to partner more directly with communities of color. A number of them are taking on efforts to build their own racial equity plans for their organizations. They made a series of commitments as part of their work with the initiative to support the agenda, and a number of them are now actually moving forward on those commitments and thinking about how to do that work. There's a lot of stumbling that's part of this work, right? And sometimes I'd say that with white organizations there can be a tendency towards navel gazing. And so to the extent to which my role and those of the Community Partner Steering Committee is to continue pushing folks and saying, come just partner with us, stop trying to think about every single perfect step that you can take. That's really important. Now, in terms of lessons, I actually think that's one of the big lessons for a lot of folks, and people have to experience it themselves, but perfection is the enemy of the good. But there's a tendency when it comes to racial equity work, especially, for people to want to be perfect. And so the ability for some of these white organizations to begin to explore partnerships, to figure out what this work looks like for them, I think has been really important. I think another thing is that challenging the understanding that access doesn't equal equity. That is something that's still an evolving concept for a lot of folks, but it was really present in the workshops that we did. And then also just even broadening the scope of what we say is environmentalism, right? So for people to understand that these 4 goals are now really part of how Seattle is approaching environmental issues, I think is a key learning, but also is a real struggle and challenge for people. And it's something that, I think I'm working and having conversations with people about that on a daily basis, and that I think will be much of the work as we continue this sort of new movement approach to environmental work, both within city government but externally, is really thinking about like how do you help an environmental movement become focused on power and shift to that mindset. I think that's an ongoing lesson that people are still working on grasping.
Thanks. I think we have a little reception.
Yeah.
So stick around, chit chat, and thank you very much.
Well, and thank you all so much.
Yes, so I'm sure Sudha will be able to answer more of your questions outside around some wine and cheese. And also, if this was exciting to you, we have another talk next week on Tuesday. So join us. Same time, same place. Hello, hello. Hello, hello.
Yeah.
I
just want to say thank you so much. I appreciate that.
As soon as we're not recording, I can tell you about 732.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And I want to read the new action items that just released a couple months ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was following a summer ago when you were first hired, and I know it was crazy. And it was just like one of the first cities to like really institutionalize this. So.
Yeah, I definitely encourage you to flip through the agenda. There's a lot about how we created the agenda up front, and then page 17 on is the actual agenda. So
it's a mic off?